Welcome everyone, Questin here with a discussion about the Paladin in World of Warcraft Burning Crusade Classic to answer some of the most frequently asked questions that I personally get. Starting out with professions, this is the one I receive the most in my videos and streams. What professions should I go for if I'm playing a Paladin in Burning Crusade Classic? Well, as per action, you would want to go engineering. In fact, I would say engineering is your essential profession to have as a pro Paladin. The first reason you would want to go with engineering is because of stamina trinkets. You can get 2 of these, though most of the time you probably would be using only 1 of them. But either way, these goblin rocket launchers not only have a very high amount of stamina, which is difficult to acquire elsewhere, like yes, there's a Netherring trinket, yes, there's an Underbog heroic trinket, yes, there are Dark Moon cards, but those options are either difficult to get, like doing Underbog is... The Underbog trinket is not worth it, it's worse. The Netherwing trinket requires Exalted Netherwing, which we don't know if we will be able to even get at the start. The Netherring questioning wasn't available in the beta, so far at the very least. And the Dark Moon cards, which have been available in beta, may not be available on the actual launch, and even if they are available, we're talking here thousands upon thousands of gold. So engineering is a much better option, at least for the start, and potentially for a very long time, dependent on how Blizzard handles things like the Netherring trinket or the Dark Moon cards, what their final decision with regards to those will be. But on top of that, on top of the fact you have 2 stamina trinkets, you also get an extra range pull ability with these goblin rocket launchers. But that's just an initial part of it, right? Regardless of when Blizzard releases the Dark Moon cards or the Netherring trinket, they will release them eventually. And at that point, you may say, well, you know, I can get the Netherring trinket as a stamina trinket, I can get the Dark Moon card, or I can get both Dark Moon cards. What's the long-term benefit of having engineering? Well, the real reason you want engineering is because of the grenades and the bombs, including super sapper charges. See, the thing about tanking in general is the threat that matters the most is your burst threat. And when it comes to Paladins, yes, we do have a measure of burst threat. Where we lack it is in terms of our AoE threat. Yes, we do have AoE threat via Consecration primarily, but it's damage over time threat. So it means you're not going to have a lot of initial threat, which means DPSers have to hold back for a couple of seconds at the very least, or maybe the full duration of a Consecration before they can go crazy on the AoE. However, if you go with grenades, if you go with super sapper charges, you can use those, put down a Consecration, do a lot of burst threat, and then start doing sustained threat, and your DPSers can go crazy from the very pull. Imagine Kael'thas. Imagine phase 2 on Kael'thas, he summons a bunch of weapons. Well, imagine throwing down a super sapper charge on those weapons, following it up with a Consecration. Your warlocks can start seeding the moment those weapons spawn. That's the benefit here of engineering. That's the real benefit. It helps you make up for some of the deficiency, one of the big deficiencies you have. And by the way, that deficiency when it comes to burst AoE threat is actually something that's going to carry over into Wrath of the Lich King. In fact, it's going to be a problem in Wrath of the Lich King as opposed to DPC, where we're the only AoE tanks. But either way, engineering should be considered an essential profession if you're playing a pro Paladin. Your second profession as a pro Paladin can either be enchanting or jewel crafting. Enchanting gives you 24 spell power and rings, which is a nice solid stat benefit that you can use, but you can also go with jewel crafting, and there you can get the Living Ruby Serpent. There are 3 trinkets that basically are the same. They have intellect, stamina, and an unused spell power effect. One of them, though, is a level 47 trinket. The other one comes with Sunwell Plateau, so the one you care about for most of the game is going to be the Living Ruby Serpent. And here's the thing, it's not as good of a stamina trinket as others are, including the rocket launchers, nor is it really a good threat trinket as some others are. But it's a good middle-of-the-road trinket. It's a trinket that has an on-use effect that you will actually use quite often in a fight, on cooldown in point of fact, to get the threat benefit. On top of that, it gives you burst threat. As I've said, burst threat is important for tanking, and this trinket can give you a measure of burst threat while also increasing your survivability and your intellect at the same time. It's a good, solid trinket that you can use for much of the game, really. In fact, when it comes to spell damage trinkets, there aren't that many great options. The McFerrin trinket only procs when you resist a spell, so you can't really rely on it. You have Icon, sure, Icon is great, but beyond Icon, the only trinket that's reliable for Fret is either the Jewel Crafting Trinket or the Scryer's Blood Gem, but the Scryer Blood Gem has Spell Hit as its passive. The Jewel Crafting Trinket has Stamina and Intellect, so it's a good middle of the road approach. As a tank, you will initially care about survival gearing, then you'll start caring about Fret, but you'll always want to compromise between Fret and survivability, and this is what the Jewel Crafting Trinket helps you do. But you can go with Enchanting if you so desire. It doesn't really matter as much, it's more so a question of preference. Do you want extra spell power or do you want extra burst threat? For my money, I want extra burst threat. I think it's very much worth it. With regards to Retribution, you want to go blacksmithing, and specifically you want to go sword specialization if you're trying to be a hardcore raider. Lionheart Champion, and then eventually with SSC and TK, Lionheart Executioner is the best in slot weapon that you can use until tier 6 pretty much. I mean, you could argue potentially for the sake of the Kalphas sword or maybe the Carafrest mace in SSC or TK when you get there. But honestly, you can get Lionheart, you can get the blacksmithing weapon and use it all the way until you either get the Terran Gorfiend weapon or the Archimand weapon. It is that powerful. It's very much worth using. As for your second profession as a Red Paladin, you can go leatherworking. Sure, Blizzard has nerfed leatherworking, but you only get the debuff that they've put in, where you can't get the effective drums for 2 minutes. You only get that debuff if you're actually within the 80-yard range that drums currently have. If you're outside of that range, you won't get it. So there's still a benefit in having leatherworking. There's also some items you may want to craft for Retribution. Not quite as important, though, as it is for other classes. Or you could go engineering, have those bombs and grenades that I mentioned earlier yourself, and have some kind of AoE damage. There are options. But honestly, the mandatory profession is blacksmithing. Anything else is secondary and honestly not that important. For Holy, you have a bunch of options, really. There's no best in slot profession. There's no mandatory profession as Holy. You could argue tailoring for the sake of the crafted gear, but that crafted gear is nowhere near as powerful on a Holy Paladin as it is for, say, a Resto Druid or a Holy Priest. So as a Holy Paladin, you have choices. You can go alchemy, you can go leatherworking, you can go whatever you want, really. And that's your main flexibility. My advice, if you're playing a Holy Paladin, go for a protection for your off-spec. If you're going to main a Holy Paladin, you're probably going to want to farm as protection. You're probably going to want to do dungeons even as protection because you're not really that great as a dungeon healer. In fact, you're the worst dungeon healer in heroic dungeons, so you may want to tank heroics, just respect to protection and tank them, so you may want to go engineering. But either way, Holy has flexibility. You can go whatever you want. The second question that I guess get asked quite a lot is Scryers versus Aldor. Well, as a Paladin, it doesn't really matter all that much. Scryers has some spellcaster rewards from their quest. Aldor has some healing and physical DPS rewards. But honestly, none of those really matter. There's always other options that you can get that are certainly easier than questing, that you'll be doing quite a lot of dungeons. That's the way to level in Burning Crusade, and you'll get quite a few items, which will be better than any of the quest rewards that Scryer or Aldor give you. So the quest rewards don't really matter. The reputation rewards, for the most part, don't really matter. The Scryer Blood Gem could be used by, say, maybe a Shakadin, or a Prop Paladin, if that's your thing, if you want to use it. But honestly, the reputation rewards aren't really worth talking about. There's not that much of a significant difference, though you could argue because of that Blood Gem for Holy PvP, that is, or protection, that Scryers are better. But that's not really what matters. In terms of the shoulder enchants, those don't really matter either, at least for Retribution and Holy. They do matter, however, for protection. Scryers have extra defense. Their Honored enchant has defense as opposed to dodge with Aldor, and the Exalted one has 5 extra defense than the Exalted Aldor one, which has 5 extra dodge. Now, from my perspective, going for Scryers is the better choice if you're playing a Prop Paladin, because sure, 5 dodge rating sounds better than 5 extra defense, but you won't really need that 5 dodge for the sake of Crush Cap. In fact, you should get Crush Cap without really requiring the extra defense or dodge from these factions, But here's the thing. The defense rating, the extra defense rating that Scryers give you is very good, very useful for the sake of resistance gearing. Paladins have a rough time, all tanks have a rough time when it comes to fire resistance gearing, frost, nature resistance gearing for the sake of Hydras, fire for Paladin, fire maybe even for Nightbane, if the current tuning that we've seen on the beta holds so far. And you want to be crit immune if you're going for fire resistance or shadow or frost or nature resistance. And that extra defense can be very useful when gearing up for that. 5 extra defense doesn't seem all that much, but when you're really struggling to get the crit cap and have resistance caps, it can be a huge benefit, especially if, as some people have suggested, resilience shouldn't help you with crit immunity. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If it does, then certainly that extra defense will be even more useful. So my advice, Scryers if you're prot, and it doesn't really matter for Holy or Retribution. You might prefer the Aldor enchant if you're Holy, for instance, but it doesn't really matter all that. Then there is the matter of Seal Vengeance and Blessing of Sanctuary. Many times, as I've played in the beta and streamed myself playing the beta, many people have asked me, well, why aren't you using Seal of Vengeance? Why aren't you using Blessing of Sanctuary? Because they're not worth using. They're not even worth really having on your bars. With Blessing of Sanctuary, it just reduces the damage you take by a fairly insignificant amount. And if you ever are in that kind of situation where that would matter, or mobs are hitting for low enough damage that you can actually benefit from it, you still don't want to use it because you want to take the damage so you don't run completely And Kings gives you 10% extra stats across the board. Yes, you want Kings. Even in a raiding situation where you might have 3 Paladins, like Holy Ret and yourself as a prot, you still wouldn't want to use Sanctuary. You would want to use Kings, you would want to use Wisdom, and you would want Blessing of Light so that the Holy Paladin in your raid, assuming you have one, actually heals for more. Sanctuary is not a blessing worth using. As for Seal of Vengeance, even that's not worth using. Apparently many Paladins, from what I've been told in the beta, have tried to tank with Seal of Vengeance and have had a pretty bad time with it, because Seal of Vengeance is not a great seal. The only situation where you would use Seal of Vengeance is if you are dealing with the target, a boss, more likely than not, where you can stack it, and you can do damage with it. But here's the thing, even on a target that stays alive long enough that you can get 5 stacks, it's still not worth using. It still will do less threat than Seal of Righteousness unless you're using a slow weapon. It's not good with a fast weapon. And virtually all the weapons, except one that you use as a prop paladin in Burning Crusade, are fast weapons. So Seal of Vengeance is less threat. The Judgment might do more damage than Righteousness, but overall, if you're using Vengeance, you'll end up doing less threat, unless you're using the Lower City Exalted weapon, which is the best in slot pre-raid weapon. But honestly, that's just one particular weapon, and even then, it's only that particular situation where you have the opportunity to stack debuff to 5. The only real use of Seal of Vengeance, it's certainly not trash, it's most of the time not even bosses, the only real use of Vengeance is if you have such a long enough boss fight where threat might matter, your sustained threat might matter, that you just want to get that extra bit of threat. So what do you do in that situation? Well, you certainly start with Righteousness, you judge it, and you use Righteousness for the entire duration of your wings, which you would start the fight with. But once that's done, you can get the 5 stacks. But here's the thing. Seal twisting is an annoying affair at the best of times, and you generally have other things to worry about as a tank than keeping the debuff on a target. And isn't your time and your CDs better spent doing the blessing spam for extra threat? Because greater blessings do give threat. You can spam Kings or Might. Might is a bit extra threat, but there's complications from that. So most of the time you would want to do Kings. You can get more threat probably from just spamming Kings on, say, the Hunters or the Warlocks in your raid than wasting your time trying to keep the debuff stacks of Vengeance. Vengeance is just not worth using, and you should never use it on trash. You should not use it in a 5-man because you want that burst threat. One of the most important things about tanking is your burst threat. when you're dealing with 5-mans, when you're dealing with trash mobs in raids, even when you're dealing with raid bosses, it is always important to have a great deal of burst threat, and Vengeance goes completely against that. Don't use it most of the time. And finally, I would say that the only real, going back to Sanctuary, the only real use of Blessing of Sanctuary, just to finish with that, is for the sake of AoE farming. If you're going to Stratholme, if you're going in Scholomance, if you're going in Zul'Farrak or Scarlet Monastery, yeah, you want to use Sanctuary because the damage reduction is useful in that case. But that's the only real use of Blessing of Sanctuary. Moving on, a lot of people ask me about what they should level as. Well, in vanilla content, if you're leveling on your own, you should go Retribution, and you're going to have a much better time than trying to level as either Protection or as Holy. Protection leveling is viable, but you need a decent amount of gear to make it work, and it can be difficult getting that gear in vanilla. Not so much in TBC, but in actual vanilla, it can be tricky. It can work in some situations. There's some places where you can do big AoE pulls, burst mobs down, and might be worth it, but most of the time, if you're leveling on your own, if you're questing, be Retribution. If you're doing dungeons, yeah, of course, Protection or Holy are the much better choices. When it comes to Burning Crusade leveling, Protection is the way to go. Now Retribution, don't play as Retribution in Burning Crusade for the sake of Burning Crusade leveling. In the open world, it's actually worse off than Protection, because Protection in BC gets a bunch of quests early on. You get a bunch of quests in Hellfire, or you can start with full gear from vanilla with a lot of spell damage, which makes Protection better. Get Reckoning, go with full spell damage gear, you will kill things probably just as fast as Retribution. You'll have much better survivability and much better sustainability. Retribution is just terrible, and honestly, the Paladin in general in Burning Crusade is probably the worst class to level overall. I mean, Warriors are worse in vanilla content just because they're so gear dependent, but you do get a good amount of gear once you step foot through the Dark Portal. So Paladins end up probably being the worst. And out of the specs, Protection is the best. Don't try and level really as Holy or as Retribution. Even if you're going to play as Holy or Retribution at max level, it's still better leveling as Protection. Not just because you'll have a much better time in the open world than either of those two, but because you are the best tank in 5-mans. You are the tank that's going to ensure 5-mans are done as quickly and efficiently as possible. So if you're leveling in TBC, gear up for Protection and level as Protection. Then change at max level. You won't really have that much competition really for DPS or healing gear. I mean, you might, you can argue with your healer and make your point about that if you care about it. But actually, many of the items you want for Holy aren't necessarily items you're going to have that much competition for. And as Retribution, you can just say, well, I'm not going to go with the physical DPSer. But again, you won't really have that much competition for many of the items. Not all of them. There are some items people want, but certainly not while leveling. Then there is the question of what race should you go for. Obviously, if you're playing Horde, you only have the option of Blood Elf. But as Alliance, I'd say the best option is going Human, regardless of what kind of Paladin you're going to play as. The reason Human matters, I mean, sure, some people could argue in favor of Draenei because of the hit. I'd argue in favor of Human because for Retribution and Protection, it's just the best choice as Alliance. In fact, Alliance Ret Paladins, if they're Human, are the best Retribution Paladins in the game. And although the expertise bonus doesn't really matter that much for Protection, I'd still argue in favor of it versus Dwarves or Draenei. That's where I stand on it. It's not going to matter that much, but it does give you a better off-spec option, and you will have some benefit, not necessarily in terms of your threat, but you will get fewer parry haste, which can be beneficial for you as a tank. And finally, the question of pre-patch. What should I do in the pre-patch when Burning Crusade, when it comes out in just a couple of days? Well, my advice for people is go do as much PvP as possible. Level up as quickly as possible. Get to 60 as quickly as possible. Doesn't matter if you're boosted. Doesn't matter if you level on your own. Just find a very quick way to level to 60. It is faster than Classic has been so far, but get to 60. Once you are 60, you will live in BGs. That's my advice. Do as many BGs as possible and get as much gear as possible. If you want the epic gear, it's probably 100k honor or so, or even more than 100k honor, and I know over 160 or so marks, BG marks. Or you can get the cheaper gear, which is going to be easier to acquire, but that depends on how much time you have available. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.